Get away from my aircraft before I have you arrested for trespassing and take your cleaning supplies with you." The words cut through the steady drumming of rain at Teterboro Airport, like a blade through silk spoken by a man who would soon discover he had just made the most expensive mistake of his entire career. But to understand how we reached this moment of reckoning, we need to go back 6 hours earlier to the sterile corridors of New York Presbyterian Hospital, where Dr. Alexandra Chen was finishing what would be remembered as one of the most challenging surgeries of her distinguished career. The overhead lights in Operating Room 7 cast harsh shadows across Alexandra's focused face as she delicately maneuvered the micro-instruments around the brainstem of 8-year-old Maria Santos, whose parents had driven 18 hours from rural Mexico seeking help that no other surgeon would provide. The tumor wrapped around the child's neural pathways like a deadly vine, and one wrong movement could leave Maria paralyzed for life or worse. Alexandra's hands, steady as steel despite the 72 hours she had been awake, guided the laser with the precision that had made her the youngest chief of neurosurgery in the hospital's history and earned her recognition as one of the most brilliant minds in her field. Pressures stable. Dr. Chen announced her surgical nurse Maria Rodriguez, who had worked alongside Alexandra for 6 years and understood the weight of this particular case. The child shared her name, and Maria had volunteered for the marathon surgery without hesitation, knowing that Alexandra never charged families who couldn't afford her services, despite the hospital administration's constant pressure to focus on more profitable cases. As Alexandra finally extracted the last fragment of the malignant growth, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, watching Maria's vital signs remain strong and steady on the monitors surrounding the operating table. "That's it," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of intense concentration. "Maria's going to dance at her quinceañera after all." The surgical team erupted in quiet celebration, understanding they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just in terms of medical skill, but in terms of what it meant to use that skill in service of those who society often overlooked. 6 hours later, as Alexandra finally emerged from the hospital into the gray October afternoon, the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, but her heart felt light knowing that Maria would wake up tomorrow with her whole life ahead of her. She had changed from her scrubs into her favorite comfort clothes, a faded Yale University hoodie that had seen her through medical school, dark jeans that had comfortable holes in the knees, and worn sneakers that had walked countless hospital corridors. Her thick black hair, a testament to her mixed African American and Asian heritage, was pulled back in a messy bun held together with a surgical clip she had forgotten to remove, and her face, beautiful even without makeup, showed the telltale signs of someone who had just spent 3 days saving a child's life. The irony of her appearance wasn't lost on Alexandra as she climbed into the back of the black Uber SUV that would take her to Teterboro Airport, where her new $65 million Gulfstream G650 waited to carry her to a medical conference in Los Angeles. Just 2 months ago, her biotech company had sold the patent for a revolutionary neural implant that could restore movement to paralyzed patients, a breakthrough that had netted her $400 million and landed her on the cover of Forbes magazine. The article had called her the miracle worker, but Alexandra preferred to think of herself simply as someone who had been given extraordinary gifts and felt compelled to use them for extraordinary good. "You're Dr. Chen, aren't you?" asked David, her Uber driver, glancing at her in the rearview mirror with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I saw you on the news last week talking about that new surgery technique you developed. My daughter wants to be a doctor because of people like you, you know. She says if a black woman can become the youngest neurosurgery chief in New York, maybe she can become a pediatrician and help kids too." Alexandra smiled, feeling the familiar mix of pride and responsibility that came with being visible in a field where people who looked like her remained rare despite decades of progress. "Your daughter can become anything she sets her mind to, David. Medicine needs more people who understand what it means to fight for every patient, not just the ones who can pay the biggest bills." She had learned this lesson early growing up in Detroit, after her father died in a factory accident, watching her mother clean office buildings at night to pay for Alexandra's education, never complaining, but always pushing her daughter to reach higher than circumstances suggested possible. As they navigated through the heavy afternoon traffic toward New Jersey, Alexandra noticed the same black SUV that had been behind them since leaving the hospital, maintaining a consistent distance through multiple lane changes and turns. Her exhaustion made her question whether she was being paranoid, but her medical training had taught her to trust patterns and observations even when they seemed unlikely. She made a mental note to mention it to airport security, though she suspected it was probably just coincidence, or perhaps an overeager journalist hoping for a photo opportunity. The rain began falling harder as they approached Teterboro, the exclusive private aviation facility that served as the gateway for Manhattan's elite who preferred to avoid the chaos and crowds of JFK or LaGuardia. Alexandra had chosen Teterboro not for its exclusivity, but for its efficiency, knowing that her schedule of surgeries research and speaking engagements required the kind of flexibility that only private aviation could provide. The irony that she could now afford such luxuries while still preferring the simple comfort of her old clothes and beat-up sneakers wasn't lost on her, but she had learned that true confidence came from knowing who you were, regardless of what you wore or owned. As David pulled up to the private terminal's security gate, Alexandra gathered her single piece of luggage, a battered medical bag that had belonged to her father who had dreamed of becoming a doctor himself before economic necessity forced him into factory work. Inside the bag were her presentation materials for tomorrow's conference, where she would announce her foundation's new program to provide free neurosurgery for children in underserved communities worldwide. The program represented the culmination of everything she had worked toward using the wealth generated by her innovations to ensure that children like Maria Santos would never again have to travel hundreds of miles, seeking care that should be available to everyone. "Thank you, David," Alexandra said as she stepped out into the rain, pulling her hood up against the October chill. "And tell your daughter that Dr. Chen believes in her completely. The world needs more doctors who understand that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about seeing every patient as deserving of our very best efforts, regardless of where they come from or what they can afford to pay." As she walked toward the gleaming white Gulf Stream that represented both her success and her commitment to using that success responsibly, Alexandra had no idea that within minutes she would face a confrontation that would test everything she believed about dignity, justice, and the power of remaining true to yourself even when others refuse to see your worth. The rain continued falling as she approached the aircraft stairs, each step carrying her closer to a moment that would change not only her own life, but the lives of countless others who had faced similar judgment based solely on the color of their skin and the assumptions that others chose to make about where they belonged in the world. Captain Derek Blake stood beneath the wing of the Gulfstream G650, ostensibly performing a routine pre-flight inspection, but actually trying to control the tremor in his hands as he checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, hoping against hope that the message he dreaded wouldn't appear on his screen. The rain drummed against the aircraft's pristine white fuselage with a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat, and each drop that rolled down the windows seemed to carry with it another reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he once thought himself to be. At 52, Derek possessed the kind of commanding presence that passengers expected from their captain. Silver hair perfectly styled despite the weather, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, and the crisp navy uniform with 4 gold stripes that had once represented everything he was proud of in his life. But beneath that polished exterior lurked a desperation so profound that it had driven him to compromise every principle he had once held sacred, transforming him from a decorated pilot with 25 years of exemplary service into someone he barely recognized when he looked in the mirror. The phone buzzed, and Derek's stomach dropped as he read the message from Vincent, his criminal contact, whose real name he had never learned and never wanted to know. Package better be delivered on schedule. "My patience is wearing thin, Captain, and you don't want to find out what happens when it runs out completely." Derek quickly deleted the message and glanced around the tarmac, paranoia making him see threats in every shadow despite the broad daylight and busy activity of the private aviation terminal. 18 months ago, Derek had been living what most people would consider a dream life. Captain of luxury aircraft for celebrities and business titans, a beautiful home in Connecticut, a wife who loved him despite his flaws, and twin daughters who looked at him like he could move mountains with his bare hands. But the gambling addiction that had lurked beneath the surface for years finally exploded into the open, when Derek convinced himself he could win back his losses from Atlantic City by betting everything on what seemed like a sure thing in Las Vegas. Within 6 weeks, he had lost his house, his marriage, his daughter's college funds, and found himself $200,000 in debt to people who viewed broken kneecaps as a reasonable form of late payment penalty. That's when Vincent approached him with an offer that seemed heaven-sent at the time, but had quickly revealed itself as a deal with the devil himself. The smuggling operation was elegant in its simplicity. Derek would use his position as captain to transport stolen luxury watches through private aviation terminals where customs inspections were notably more relaxed than at commercial airports. The watches worth millions of dollars and stolen from high-end retailers across Europe would be hidden in the aircraft's cargo compartments during routine maintenance, then removed by Vincent's associates at various private airports across the United States. Derek's cut was enough to keep the dangerous men from breaking his legs, but never enough to actually escape the cycle of debt and fear that had consumed his life. Captain Blake. The voice belonged to James Mitchell, his 28-year-old co-pilot whose earnest enthusiasm and unwavering integrity reminded Derek painfully of his younger self, before life had worn away his moral certainty like sandpaper on wood. James stood at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, rain dripping from his uniform cap, holding a clipboard with the pre-flight paperwork that Derek should have been reviewing instead of obsessing over criminal text messages. "What is it?" Mitchell. Derek snapped his nerves, making him harsher than necessary with a young man who had done nothing but try to learn from someone he still foolishly believed was worthy of respect. James flinched slightly at the tone but maintained his professional composure, a quality that Derek envied and resented in equal measure. "Just wanted to confirm the passenger manifest," Sir James replied, consulting his paperwork despite the rain that was beginning to soak through the pages. "We have Dr. A. Chen listed as our primary passenger departing for Los Angeles at 14:30 hours. The passenger services coordinator mentioned that doctor. Chen specifically requested minimal ground crew interaction and would be arriving in a private vehicle rather than using the terminal's VIP lounge services." Derek's mind immediately conjured the image he expected. Some wealthy Chinese businessman, probably in tech or manufacturing, who had made his fortune in Silicon Valley and now wanted to travel in privacy and comfort while conducting business calls over the Pacific Ocean. The assumption came easily to Derek, whose worldview had been shaped by 25 years of flying for clients who fit predictable patterns, and whose growing resentment toward his current circumstances had made him increasingly quick to judge others based on stereotypes that felt safely distant from his own complicated reality. "Probably wants to conduct business without interruption," Derek muttered more to himself than to James as he continued his supposed inspection of the landing gear while actually checking for any signs that Vincent's people had already loaded their illegal cargo during the night shift. These tech billionaires are all the same. Think they own the sky just because they can afford to rent a piece of it for a few hours. James nodded politely, though something in his expression suggested he was uncomfortable with Derek's dismissive tone, a discomfort that Derek chose to ignore because acknowledging it would mean confronting his own growing bitterness toward the wealthy passengers whose money kept him employed but whose success highlighted everything he had lost through his own poor choices. The irony that he was now stealing from people not unlike his passengers wasn't lost on Derek, but he had become expert at compartmentalizing such uncomfortable realizations. "Sir, if I may ask," James began hesitantly, his natural curiosity overcoming his reluctance to probe into matters that seemed to make his captain increasingly agitated. "You seem a bit on edge lately. Is everything all right at home? I know the job can be stressful, and if there's anything I can do to help with the workload." Derek turned sharply, his eyes flashing with the kind of controlled anger that came from a man who had spent months living on the edge of discovery, knowing that one wrong move or one observant crew member could bring his entire carefully constructed deception crashing down around him. "My personal life is none of your concern, Mitchell. Focus on your own responsibilities and let me worry about mine." The rebuke hit James like a physical blow, and Derek immediately felt the familiar pang of guilt that came with taking his stress out on innocent people who were only trying to help. But acknowledging that guilt would mean opening a door to all the other guilt he was carrying, and Derek had learned that the only way to function in his current circumstances was to keep that door firmly closed, even if it meant becoming someone his daughters would be ashamed to call their father. As if summoned by his guilty thoughts, Derek's phone buzzed again with a text from his ex-wife. "Sarah, girls are asking when they can see you again. I keep making excuses, but they're not stupid, Derek. They know something is wrong. Please tell me you're getting help." Derek stared at the message for a long moment, remembering the last time he had seen his daughters, how they had looked at him with a mixture of love and worry that had nearly broken his heart completely. He started to type a response 3 different times before deleting each attempt and putting the phone away, telling himself he would deal with his family situation after he completed this final smuggling run and could somehow find a way back to being the man they deserved. From the galley came the sound of Emma Rodriguez, their flight attendant, humming softly as she prepared the cabin for their passengers' arrival. At 26, Emma possessed the kind of warmth and genuine care for passenger comfort that made her invaluable in the luxury aviation industry. But Derek had noticed her growing discomfort with some of his recent attitudes toward certain passengers, particularly those who didn't fit his increasingly narrow definition of what a wealthy traveler should look like. Emma's parents had immigrated from Colombia when she was young, and Derek suspected she had faced her own share of prejudice and judgment, making her sensitive to the subtle ways that bias could manifest, even in professional settings. Derek checked his watch and realized their passenger would be arriving soon, which meant Vincent's associates would be expecting confirmation that their package was aboard and ready for transport to the West Coast, where it would be removed during a routine maintenance inspection that Derek had specifically requested for reasons that had nothing to do with the aircraft's mechanical condition. The weight of what he was about to do, using his position and expertise to commit a federal crime that could result in decades in prison, pressed down on him like a physical burden, but the alternative of facing Vincent's wrath seemed even more terrifying in his current state of mind. "Mitchell." Derek called out, his voice artificially calm as he made his final preparations for what he desperately hoped would be his last flight as a criminal review the weather reports for our route to Los Angeles. "I want to make sure we have alternatives planned in case we encounter any unexpected situations that might require flexibility in our flight plan." The request was perfectly reasonable for a safety-conscious captain, but Derek knew that the real reason for wanting alternative routes had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with ensuring they could reach their destination, even if air traffic control or other authorities became unexpectedly interested in their cargo. As James headed toward the cockpit to check the weather reports, Derek allowed himself one last look at the stolen watches hidden in the cargo compartment, each one representing not just a crime, but a step further away from the man he had once been and the father he still desperately wanted to become again. The black Uber SUV pulled up to the security checkpoint at Teterboro's private aviation terminal, just as the afternoon rain reached its peak intensity, turning the windshield into a watercolor canvas of running droplets that blurred the world beyond into abstract shapes and shadows. Security guard Thomas Wilson looked up from his smartphone, where he had been reading about the latest celebrity scandal, expecting to see another limousine or luxury sedan carrying someone whose wealth and status would be immediately apparent from their vehicle, their clothing, and their entourage of assistants and handlers. Instead, he saw a tired-looking woman in a gray hoodie emerging from what was obviously a rideshare vehicle carrying a single worn duffel bag and moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had been awake far too long but was determined not to show it. Thomas squinted through the rain-streaked window of his security booth, consulting his passenger manifest, with the kind of confusion that came from seeing reality refuse to match his expectations. Name and aircraft tail number, Thomas asked through the intercom, his voice carrying a note of skepticism that he didn't bother to hide, because his experience had taught him that people who belonged at Teterboro typically arrived with more ceremony and considerably more expensive transportation than a standard Uber ride. Dr. Alexandra Chen. Alexandra replied clearly, pulling her hood back to reveal her face as she approached the security window, rain immediately beginning to soak her hair, despite her efforts to shield herself with the duffel bag. Tail number November 7. 20 Alpha. Charlie. It's the Gulfstream G650 that should be parked at spot 14, according to my flight coordinator. Thomas typed slowly into his computer, frowning at the screen, as if the information displayed there couldn't possibly be correct. His eyes moved between Alexandra's face, her clothing, her vehicle, and the passenger manifest that clearly listed Doctor. Chen, as the primary passenger for the $65 million aircraft currently receiving its final pre-flight preparations. The disconnect between what he was seeing and what he expected created a cognitive dissonance that his brain resolved by assuming there must be some mistake in the paperwork, or perhaps some confusion about Alexandra's actual role in the day's flight. "You're listed as the passenger," Thomas said, his tone suggesting that he found this information difficult to believe despite seeing it in black and white on his official records. Not the pilot or crew member, but the actual passenger who owns the aircraft. "I am," Alexandra confirmed, patiently understanding from years of experience that her appearance often created this kind of confusion, and that responding with grace and clarity usually resolved the situation more quickly than showing the irritation she had every right to feel. "I purchased the aircraft 2 months ago through Stevens Aviation Holdings, and this is my first flight as the owner. Is there a problem with my documentation?" Thomas continued staring at his screen as if hoping the information might change. If he looked at it long enough, then glanced again at Alexandra, standing in the rainwater beginning to drip from her clothes onto the concrete beneath her feet. His training told him to verify identification and cross-reference it with the passenger manifest, but his assumptions about what wealthy aircraft owners looked like created a hesitation that revealed more about his own biases than about any actual security concerns. "I just need to see some identification," Thomas finally said, though he had not requested identification from the previous 3 passengers who had passed through his checkpoint that afternoon, all of whom had been white men in expensive suits who had arrived in vehicles that matched his expectations about private aviation clientele. Alexandra reached into her bag and produced her driver's license along with the aircraft registration papers that her attorney had advised her to carry during the first few months of ownership. Understanding that her appearance might create exactly this kind of situation and wanting to be prepared to resolve it quickly and professionally. Thomas examined the documents with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for international border crossings, comparing the photograph to Alexandra's face multiple times before reluctantly acknowledging that everything appeared to be in order. "Go ahead," Thomas said, pressing the button to raise the security gate, though his expression remained skeptical as he watched Alexandra climb back into the Uber for the short drive to the aircraft parking area. He made a note in his log about the unusual passenger arrival method and decided to keep an eye on the situation in case airport security needed to be involved later. The Uber pulled up beside the gleaming white Gulfstream G650, its elegant lines and perfect proportions representing the pinnacle of private aviation engineering and luxury accommodation. Alexandra paid David and gathered her belongings, taking a moment to appreciate the aircraft that represented not just her financial success, but her commitment to using that success to expand her ability to provide medical care to patients around the world. The jet would allow her to reach medical conferences, disaster areas, and underserved communities with the kind of speed and flexibility that would ultimately save lives, making the substantial purchase price feel like an investment in her life's mission rather than an indulgence. Standing at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, conducting what appeared to be a pre-flight inspection, but was actually an increasingly agitated surveillance of the surrounding area, Captain Derek Blake caught sight of the approaching passenger and felt his stress levels spike even higher than its already dangerous plateau. Instead of the wealthy businessman he had expected, he saw a woman who looked like she had just finished a night shift at a hospital or restaurant, wearing clothes that belonged in a college dormitory rather than aboard a luxury aircraft worth more than most people's houses. Derek's first assumption, shaped by years of stereotypes and his current state of criminal paranoia, was that Alexandra must be some kind of service worker who had gotten confused about her destination, or perhaps was attempting some kind of security breach that could jeopardize his carefully planned smuggling operation. The possibility that she might actually be the passenger he was expecting never entered his mind because it contradicted everything he believed about wealth status and who belonged in the rarefied world of private aviation. "Excuse me," Derek called out as Alexandra began walking toward the stairs, his voice carrying the kind of authority he had perfected over decades of dealing with difficult passengers and ground crew members who sometimes needed to be reminded of their place in the aviation hierarchy. "You're at the wrong aircraft. This is a private jet, not a commercial terminal." Alexandra paused at the bottom of the stairs, rain continuing to fall around her as she looked up at the uniformed man who was blocking her path with the kind of physical posture that suggested he had no intention of moving aside until she explained herself to his satisfaction. She had encountered this type of situation before, the assumption that her appearance and clothing meant she couldn't possibly belong in spaces reserved for wealth and success. And she had learned to handle it with a combination of patience and firm clarity that usually resolved the confusion without unnecessary confrontation. "I'm Dr. Alexandra Chen," she replied calmly, raising her voice slightly to carry over the sound of rain on metal and the distant hum of jet engines warming up across the tarmac. "I believe you're expecting me as your passenger for the flight to Los Angeles this afternoon?" Derek's reaction was immediate and visceral, a short bark of laughter that carried no humor and considerable contempt, as if Alexandra had just told him she was the Queen of England or claimed to be able to fly the aircraft herself through the power of positive thinking. His stress about the illegal cargo hidden in the aircraft's compartments, combined with his growing resentment toward the wealthy passengers whose success highlighted his own failures, created a toxic mixture of paranoia and prejudice that made him incapable of processing what should have been obvious truth. "Listen, sweetheart," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension as he descended 2 steps to loom over Alexandra from his position on the stairs, using his height and uniform to reinforce the authority he assumed she would automatically recognize and respect. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing or who sent you here, but this aircraft is reserved for a very important passenger who will be arriving at any moment." The word "sweetheart" hit Alexandra like a physical slap, carrying with it every condescending interaction she had endured during medical school, every board meeting where her ideas had been dismissed until a male colleague repeated them, and every moment when her expertise had been questioned because of assumptions about her gender and race, rather than recognition of her qualifications and achievements. But her years of dealing with life-and-death situations in operating rooms had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, even when every instinct screamed at her to respond to disrespect with the anger it deserved. Captain Alexandra said, reading the name tag on Derek's uniform as she spoke with the kind of controlled authority she used when dealing with difficult surgeons or hospital administrators who needed to be reminded that she was in charge. "I am the passenger you're waiting for. I have my identification and aircraft registration papers if you need to verify my identity." Derek's response revealed the depth of his prejudice and the extent to which his criminal activities had distorted his judgment, creating a feedback loop where his desperation to complete the smuggling operation made him see threats and complications where none existed. Instead of simply checking Alexandra's documentation, which would have resolved the situation in 30 seconds, he chose to double down on his assumption that she couldn't possibly be who she claimed to be. "You expect me to believe," Derek said, his voice rising with each word, as rain continued to soak through his uniform and his paranoia reached new heights, "that the owner of a $65 million aircraft shows up looking like she just finished cleaning bathrooms at the airport terminal. Get real, lady. Security must be getting lazy if they're letting people like you wander around the tarmac taking selfies with expensive jets." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon, its meaning unmistakable despite Derek's refusal to explicitly acknowledge the racial assumptions that drove his behavior. From inside the aircraft, James Mitchell watched the confrontation through the cockpit window with growing discomfort, his instincts telling him that something was very wrong about the way his captain was treating what appeared to be their passenger, regardless of her appearance or choice of clothing. Alexandra reached into her bag and pulled out her smartphone, her movements deliberate and calm despite the anger that was building beneath her professional exterior like pressure in a steam boiler that was approaching dangerous levels. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with this type of situation was to go directly to the source of authority, rather than trying to convince someone whose mind was already closed to evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. "I'm going to make a phone call," Captain Alexandra said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet intensity that made smart people pay attention and foolish people double down on their mistakes. "When I finish this call, you're going to understand exactly who you're dealing with and exactly how much trouble you've just created for yourself." Derek watched with contempt and amusement as Alexandra dialed a number, convinced that she was either calling a friend to pick her up or perhaps contacting some kind of customer service line to complain about being removed from the aircraft. The possibility that she might actually have the authority to end his career with a single conversation never occurred to him because it would have required acknowledging that his assumptions about her were wrong, and Derek had too much invested in those assumptions to give them up easily. "Robert," Alexandra said when the call connected, her voice carrying clearly across the tarmac as she spoke to Robert Thorne, the CEO of the aviation management company responsible for staffing and maintaining her aircraft. "This is Dr. Alexandra Chen. I'm standing in the rain at Teterboro Airport next to my Gulfstream, and I'm being prevented from boarding by the captain you assigned to fly my aircraft to Los Angeles this afternoon." Derek's smirk faltered slightly as he heard Alexandra's tone and the specificity of her complaint, but he convinced himself that she was simply putting on an elaborate performance for his benefit, perhaps hoping to intimidate him into allowing her aboard so she could steal something or take photographs for some kind of social media scam that he had heard about happening at other private aviation facilities. "His name is Captain Derek Blake." Alexandra continued, her eyes locked on Derek's face as she spoke with the kind of professional precision that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously when she spoke. "And he seems to believe that I'm not qualified to board my own aircraft because of the way I'm dressed, and perhaps because of the way I look." The mention of his name seemed to trigger something in Derek's brain, a flicker of doubt that he quickly suppressed because acknowledging it would mean confronting the possibility that he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment that could cost him everything he was desperately trying to preserve. He crossed his arms and maintained his position blocking the aircraft stairs, determined to call what he was certain was an elaborate bluff designed to embarrass him or get him in trouble with his supervisors. "Would you like to speak with him directly?" Alexandra asked, holding out her phone toward Derek with the kind of expression that suggested she was offering him a chance to save himself from a situation that was about to become much worse than he could possibly imagine. "Robert has some questions about your conduct and your understanding of who exactly pays your salary." Derek looked at the phone with a mixture of defiance and growing uncertainty, his criminal paranoia warring with his professional instincts as he tried to decide whether taking the call would expose him to greater risk or provide an opportunity to explain his behavior in terms that would preserve his position and allow him to complete his smuggling operation without further complications. The rain continued falling around them, each drop carrying with it another second of Derek's career ticking away toward a conclusion that would change both their lives forever. Derek's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for Alexandra's phone, his mind racing through a dozen different scenarios about who might be on the other end of the line and what they might know about his recent activities, both legal and illegal. The weight of the device felt impossibly heavy in his palm, as if it contained all the consequences of his choices over the past 18 months compressed into a few ounces of metal and glass that were about to explode his carefully constructed world into 1,000 irreparable pieces. "This is Captain Blake," Derek said into the phone, his voice artificially steady as he tried to project the confidence and authority that had once come naturally to him but now felt like an ill-fitting costume he was struggling to maintain. "I'm going to need you to verify the identity of this individual who claims to be our passenger, because she doesn't match the profile we typically see for owners of luxury aircraft, and I have security concerns about allowing unauthorized personnel aboard." The voice that erupted from the phone's speaker was so loud and furious that James Mitchell could hear it clearly from inside the cockpit 20 feet away, and Emma Rodriguez paused in her cabin preparations as the unmistakable sound of an executive losing his temper carried through the aircraft's thin hull. Robert Thorne's voice contained the kind of rage that came from a man who had just realized that one of his employees had potentially destroyed a relationship worth millions of dollars through sheer stupidity and prejudice. "Blake, have you completely lost your mind?" Thorne screamed his words, punctuated by what sounded like papers being thrown across his office in Manhattan, where he had been in a meeting with potential clients when Alexandra's call interrupted his carefully planned presentation. "Dr. Chen purchased that aircraft through our company 6 weeks ago. She's one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. She's worth more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. And you're standing there in the rain questioning whether she belongs on her own goddamn airplane." Derek felt the blood drain from his face so quickly that he had to grab the stair railing to keep from losing his balance, his vision blurring slightly as the full magnitude of his mistake became apparent not just in terms of his career, but in terms of how it would affect his ability to complete the smuggling operation that represented his only hope of avoiding Vincent's violent retribution. The phone suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and he had to use both hands to keep from dropping it as Thorne continued his verbal assault. "Sir, I was following security protocols," Derek stammered, grasping for any explanation that might salvage his position and allow him to complete what was supposed to be his final criminal flight before attempting to extract himself from Vincent's organization. In today's environment, we have to be suspicious of anyone who approaches expensive aircraft without proper identification or appropriate attire. Security protocols. Thorne's laugh contained no humor whatsoever, just the bitter amusement of a man who had spent 30 years in the aviation industry and recognized bullshit when he heard it. "Blake, I've seen the security footage from 3 weeks ago when that YouTuber jumped the fence to film a prank video with one of our jets. You didn't call security then, did you? You took a selfie with him and asked about his subscriber count before politely suggesting he leave the property." The reference to the YouTuber incident hit Derek like a physical blow, because it revealed not just his hypocrisy, but the clear pattern of racial bias that governed his behavior, treating young white men as harmless, even when they were actually trespassing, while viewing a successful black woman as a threat, simply because her appearance didn't match his narrow expectations. Derek's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he tried to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate him, but his brain seemed to have temporarily shut down under the combined pressure of professional humiliation and criminal panic. "I want you to apologize to Dr. Chen." Immediately, Thorne continued, his voice dropping to the kind of deadly quiet that was somehow more terrifying than screaming. "Then I want you to get her aboard that aircraft and provide the most professional service of your entire career, because if she files a complaint with the FAA, or decides to take her business elsewhere, I'm going to hold you personally responsible for every dollar we lose." Derek turned toward Alexandra with the expression of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse in real time, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, anger, and desperation, as he tried to process how a simple security check had evolved into a career-ending catastrophe that threatened to expose not just his prejudices, but his criminal activities to exactly the kind of scrutiny he had been desperately trying to avoid. "Doctor." Derek began, his voice cracking slightly as he handed her phone back with hands that were now visibly shaking. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. I was simply being cautious about aircraft security, and I clearly made an error in judgment about your identity and your right to be here." Alexandra accepted her phone and slipped it back into her pocket, her expression remaining neutral despite the satisfaction she felt at watching Derek's arrogance crumble into pathetic groveling that revealed the fundamental weakness beneath his authoritarian posture. She had seen this transformation before in surgeons who had challenged her expertise, only to discover they were arguing with someone whose knowledge and skill far exceeded their own. But the racial dimension of Derek's assumptions made his comeuppance feel particularly justified. Captain Blake Alexandra said, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to be more devastating than anger because it demonstrated her refusal to descend to his level, despite his unprovoked disrespect. "I'm going to board my aircraft now, and I expect you to fly me to Los Angeles with the professionalism that I was promised when your company was hired to provide these services." As Derek scrambled aside to clear a path to the aircraft stairs, his movements clumsy and desperate like a man trying to retrieve something precious that was falling through his fingers, James Mitchell appeared in the cockpit doorway, with an expression that mixed curiosity with growing concern about his captain's behavior and judgment. Emma Rodriguez emerged from the galley with a look of barely concealed disgust at what she had witnessed, her own experiences with discrimination making her particularly sensitive to the ugly dynamic that had just played out on the tarmac. "Doctor," Emma said warmly as Alexandra reached the top of the stairs, her tone providing a sharp contrast to Derek's hostility and revealing the kind of genuine hospitality that distinguished quality service providers from those who were simply going through the motions. "Welcome aboard your aircraft. I'm Emma Rodriguez, your flight attendant, and I want to assure you that the rest of your journey will be much more pleasant than your arrival experience." Alexandra smiled gratefully at Emma's kindness, recognizing a kindred spirit in the young woman's eyes, and sensing that Emma understood exactly what had just transpired and why it was so fundamentally wrong on multiple levels. "Thank you, Emma. I appreciate your professionalism, especially given the circumstances of the last few minutes." As Alexandra disappeared into the aircraft's luxurious cabin, Derek climbed the stairs with the heavy steps of a condemned man walking to his execution, knowing that his behavior had not only humiliated him professionally, but had also created exactly the kind of attention and scrutiny that could expose the illegal cargo hidden in the aircraft's compartments. James Mitchell watched his captain's face carefully, noting the signs of stress that went far beyond what should be expected from a simple passenger relations incident. Captain James said quietly as they prepared to close the aircraft door and begin their departure procedures, "Is everything all right? You seem unusually agitated today, and that situation with Dr. Chen was pretty intense. Maybe we should talk about what happened before we take off." Derek's response revealed the depth of his desperation and the way his criminal activities had distorted his relationships with everyone around him, creating a paranoid isolation that made him see potential threats in even well-meaning colleagues who were trying to help. Instead of acknowledging James's legitimate concerns or using the opportunity to rebuild some semblance of trust with his crew, Derek chose to attack the messenger rather than address the message. "Mind your own business, Mitchell." Derek snapped his voice, carrying a venom that surprised even him as he realized how far he had fallen from the mentor and leader he had once been. "Focus on the pre-flight checklist and leave the passenger relations to me. I've been flying for longer than you've been alive, and I don't need career advice from someone who just earned his commercial license last year." The rebuke hit James like a slap, causing him to step back and reassess his relationship with a man he had once looked up to as a model of professionalism and expertise. The change in Derek's behavior over the past few months had been gradual but unmistakable, transforming him from a respected captain into someone who seemed angry at the world and particularly hostile toward passengers who didn't fit his increasingly narrow definition of acceptable clientele. Inside the aircraft's main cabin, Alexandra settled into the plush leather seat that would be her home for the next 5 hours, allowing herself to feel the exhaustion that she had been fighting since her marathon surgery ended that morning. The confrontation with Derek had been more draining than she wanted to admit, not because of its intensity, but because of its familiarity, representing just another in a long series of encounters where she had been forced to prove her right to exist in spaces where her presence challenged other people's assumptions about success and belonging. Emma approached with a warm towel and a cup of perfectly prepared coffee, her service somehow managing to feel both professional and personal, as she demonstrated the kind of intuitive understanding that separated great hospitality from mere competence. "Dr. Chen, I hope you'll forgive Captain Blake's behavior. I've been working with him for several months, and I've noticed some concerning patterns in how he treats certain passengers that frankly make me uncomfortable." Alexandra accepted the coffee, gratefully appreciating Emma's willingness to acknowledge what had happened, rather than pretending it was just a simple misunderstanding that everyone should forget and move on from without addressing the underlying issues it revealed. "Thank you for saying that, Emma. It means more than you might realize to know that someone else recognized what just happened for what it really was." From the cockpit came the sound of Derek's voice as he conducted his pre-flight radio checks with air traffic control. His tone artificially calm and professional as he tried to project normalcy despite the chaos that was churning beneath his polished exterior. James completed his portion of the checklist with mechanical precision, but his growing unease about Derek's state of mind created an undercurrent of tension that threatened to affect their ability to function as an effective flight crew. As the powerful engines began their startup sequence and the aircraft prepared to taxi toward the runway that would carry them into what Derek desperately hoped would be his final flight as a criminal. None of them could have predicted that the confrontation at the aircraft stairs was merely the opening scene of a drama that would culminate in revelations far more shocking than simple prejudice and professional misconduct. The rain continued falling on the tarmac they were leaving behind, washing away the evidence of their departure, but unable to cleanse the consequences of choices that had already set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The Gulfstream G650 climbed smoothly through the thick cloud layer above New Jersey, its twin Rolls-Royce engines pulling the aircraft effortlessly toward its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. While Derek struggled to maintain his professional composure in the captain's seat despite the multiple crises that were converging on him like storm fronts colliding over dangerous terrain. The humiliation of the tarmac confrontation had shaken him badly enough, but the knowledge that his passenger was now someone with the wealth connections and motivation to scrutinize every aspect of his performance made the illegal cargo hidden in the aircraft's aft compartment feel like a ticking bomb that could explode at any moment. James Mitchell completed the climb checklist with his usual efficiency, but his movements carried an undertone of wariness as he watched Derek's increasingly erratic behavior with growing concern that went beyond simple professional disagreement and entered the territory of genuine worry about his captain's fitness for duty. The 28-year-old co-pilot had learned to read the subtle signs of stress in experienced pilots, and everything about Derek's demeanor suggested a man operating under pressures that extended far beyond the normal challenges of commercial aviation. "Captain, we're level at flight level 410. James reported, his voice carefully neutral as he tried to assess whether Derek was hearing and processing the routine communications that were essential for safe flight operations. "Air traffic control is clearing us direct to our first waypoint, and the weather ahead looks clear for the next 200 miles. Derek acknowledged the report with a distracted grunt. His attention divided between the aircraft systems and the encrypted phone that kept buzzing in his pocket, with what he knew were increasingly urgent messages from Vincent about the delivery schedule for their stolen merchandise. The criminal operation had always depended on precise timing and careful coordination, but the unexpected complications with Alexandra had already thrown their carefully planned schedule into potential jeopardy. In the main cabin, Alexandra tried to focus on the research proposal she needed to review before her presentation in Los Angeles, but the combination of physical exhaustion and emotional drain from the morning's confrontation made concentration difficult despite the aircraft's smooth flight and luxurious accommodations. She had hoped that owning her own jet would eliminate the constant stress of dealing with discrimination during travel. But Derek's behavior had reminded her that money and success could provide many advantages without necessarily changing other people's fundamental attitudes about where she belonged in the world. Emma Rodriguez moved through the cabin with practiced grace, ensuring that Alexandra had everything she needed for a comfortable flight while simultaneously keeping a careful eye on the cockpit door and wondering whether she should mention her growing concerns about Derek's recent behavior to someone in management. Over the past few months, she had witnessed several incidents where Derek had treated minority passengers with a level of hostility and suspicion that seemed to go far beyond normal security consciousness, creating an atmosphere of tension that made her job significantly more difficult and morally uncomfortable. "Doctor," Chen Emma said softly as she refreshed Alexandra's coffee and ensured the cabin temperature was comfortable. "Would you mind if I asked what kind of medical work brings you to Los Angeles?" "I attended one of your presentations about pediatric neurosurgery last year, and it was absolutely fascinating." Alexandra looked up with surprise and genuine pleasure, always happy to discover that her work had reached people outside the medical community, and particularly grateful for any conversation that moved beyond the unpleasantness of her boarding experience. "You were at the Children's Hospital Conference. I remember that presentation. We discussed the new techniques for treating brain tumors in infants. It's one of the most challenging areas in neurosurgery, but also one of the most rewarding when we can give a child their whole life back." As they talked about Alexandra's upcoming presentation on her foundation's new program to provide free neurosurgery for children in developing countries, Emma found herself increasingly impressed, not just by Alexandra's medical achievements, but by her genuine passion for using her success to help others who lacked access to advanced medical care. The conversation provided a stark contrast to Derek's earlier assumptions about Alexandra's character and worthiness, highlighting the ugly absurdity of judging anyone based on their appearance rather than their actions and accomplishments. 2 hours into the flight, Alexandra excused herself to use the aircraft's private bedroom, hoping to get some rest before her demanding schedule in Los Angeles required her to be at her intellectual and physical best for presentations to potential foundation donors and medical colleagues. The bedroom represented one of the Gulfstream's most luxurious features, with a full-sized bed, premium bedding, and enough space to truly relax during long flights across multiple time zones. As Alexandra entered the bedroom and began settling in for what she hoped would be a brief but restorative nap, her attention was caught by something that seemed out of place in the meticulously maintained aircraft interior. One of the storage compartment doors was slightly ajar, revealing a small piece of black plastic that had apparently been caught in the mechanism when someone had closed it hastily without ensuring proper clearance. Alexandra's medical training had developed her observational skills to an extraordinary degree, teaching her to notice subtle details that others might overlook. Because in surgery, such attention to minutiae could mean the difference between life and death for her patients. The sight of the improperly closed compartment triggered her professional curiosity, particularly since everything else about the aircraft's preparation had been absolutely perfect in terms of cleanliness and attention to detail. Moving closer to investigate what appeared to be a minor maintenance issue that she could mention to the crew for correction during their next service interval, Alexandra carefully opened the compartment door and discovered something that immediately transformed her understanding of why Derek had been so agitated and hostile during their encounter at Teterboro. Instead of the extra blankets and pillows she had expected to find, the compartment contained 3 large black cases that had obviously been hidden behind the legitimate storage items in a way that would escape casual detection. The cases were professional-grade Pelican containers, the kind used for transporting delicate equipment or valuable items that required protection from shock and moisture during transport. Alexandra's heart rate increased as she realized that she had stumbled onto something that was clearly not part of the aircraft's normal cargo, and her instincts told her that whatever was in those cases was almost certainly illegal and potentially dangerous to everyone aboard the aircraft. With the same careful methodology she applied to complex surgical procedures, Alexandra photographed the cases and their positioning before carefully extracting one of them from the compartment to examine it more closely. The case was heavier than expected and secured with a combination lock that had been left open, suggesting that whoever had placed it there had been in a hurry or had planned to access it again during the flight. Opening the case with trembling fingers, Alexandra gasped audibly at the contents. Dozens of luxury watches nestled in custom-cut foam, each one representing what she immediately recognized as extraordinary value based on the brands and craftsmanship visible even to her untrained eye. She pulled out her phone and used the camera to search for information about one of the watches, discovering that it was a limited edition Patek Philippe worth more than $300,000 and listed as stolen from a Beverly Hills jewelry store just 2 weeks earlier. The realization that she was aboard an aircraft being used for smuggling stolen goods worth millions of dollars sent a chill through Alexandra's body that had nothing to do with the temperature-controlled cabin environment. She understood immediately that Derek's hostility toward her had been motivated by more than simple prejudice. He had been terrified that her unexpected appearance and scrutiny would somehow expose his criminal operation and destroy whatever desperate scheme he had constructed to justify risking everything he had once valued about his career and reputation. As Alexandra photographed the evidence and began to understand the full scope of what she had discovered, the aircraft suddenly lurched violently to one side, throwing her against the bulkhead and causing the open case to slide across the floor with a crash that scattered priceless timepieces across the bedroom carpet like expensive confetti. From the cockpit came the sound of warning alarms and James Mitchell's urgent voice calling for Derek to respond to what was clearly a significant mechanical emergency. "Engine 2 is showing abnormal readings," James shouted over the increasing noise of warning systems that indicated multiple aircraft malfunctions occurring simultaneously. "We're losing power and hydraulic pressure. Captain, I need you to take control while I run the emergency checklist." But Derek was not in the cockpit to respond to the emergency because he had chosen that exact moment to leave his post and check on the hidden cargo that represented his only hope of satisfying Vincent's demands and avoiding the violent consequences of failing to complete their smuggling operation. Instead of focusing on his primary responsibility to ensure the safety of his aircraft and passengers, Derek had allowed his criminal paranoia to override his professional judgment at the worst possible moment. Alexandra found herself trapped in the bedroom with millions of dollars in stolen merchandise scattered around her feet while the aircraft began what felt like an uncontrolled descent toward the Rocky Mountains that loomed invisibly in the darkness below. She grabbed the aircraft's internal phone and dialed the cockpit, desperate to alert the crew to the emergency and somehow help them regain control before her discovery of Derek's crimes became irrelevant in the face of a catastrophic crash that would kill everyone aboard. The phone rang repeatedly without answer as the aircraft continued its terrifying plunge through the night sky, and Alexandra realized with growing horror that she might be about to die in the bedroom of her own jet, surrounded by evidence of crimes she had uncovered purely by accident, but which had somehow contributed to a mechanical emergency that threatened to end all their lives in the mountains of Colorado. Through the small bedroom window, she could see the lights of Denver beginning to appear below them, growing larger with each second as the aircraft descended toward what she could only hope would be an emergency landing rather than an unsurvivable crash. The cockpit of the Gulfstream G650 had transformed into a maelstrom of flashing warning lights, urgent alarms, and automated voice warnings that created a sensory assault so overwhelming that James Mitchell had to fight against his natural human instinct to freeze in the face of catastrophic system failures occurring faster than he could process them. The master caution panel displayed a Christmas tree of red and amber lights indicating problems with the right engine, hydraulic systems, electrical generation, and flight control computers, while the synthetic voice of the aircraft's warning system repeated, "Engine failure, with mechanical persistence that somehow made the emergency feel both more real and more surreal." Captain Blake James screamed toward the empty pilot's seat while his hands flew across the overhead panel, following emergency procedures that he had practiced countless times in simulators but had never expected to encounter in actual flight with a missing captain and passengers, depending on his ability to save their lives. "I need you in here now. We have multiple system failures and I can't handle this alone." The aircraft was descending rapidly through 37,000 feet. Its rate of descent increasing as the failed right engine created not just a loss of power, but an asymmetric thrust situation that was trying to pull the aircraft into a deadly spiral toward the mountains that surrounded Denver, like sleeping giants waiting to claim any pilot who made a mistake in the thin air and treacherous winds of high-altitude Colorado aviation. James could feel the aircraft fighting against his control inputs, the sophisticated fly-by-wire systems struggling to compensate for the engine failure, while he tried to maintain level flight and navigate toward the nearest suitable airport. From somewhere behind the cockpit door came the sound of Derek's voice, not responding to James's urgent calls for assistance, but apparently engaged in some kind of heated argument with a passenger. His words muffled by the aircraft structure, but his tone clearly indicating anger and desperation that had nothing to do with the mechanical emergency that was threatening to kill everyone aboard. James felt a cold realization wash over him as he understood that his captain had abandoned his post during a critical emergency to deal with some personal crisis that he apparently considered more important than the safety of the flight. Denver Center, Gulfstream. 720 Alpha. Charlie declaring an emergency, James transmitted on the radio, his voice fighting to remain calm and professional, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. "We have engine failure with multiple system malfunctions requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." The air traffic controller's response came through James's headset with the kind of crisp efficiency that characterized professionals dealing with life-and-death situations providing immediate assistance, without wasting time on unnecessary questions or procedures that could delay potentially life-saving action. Gulfstream 20 Alpha Charlie Denver Center. Roger. Your emergency. You are cleared direct. Denver International Airport runway 34. Left is available for emergency landing. Fire and rescue equipment is being positioned. In the aircraft's bedroom, Alexandra had managed to grab hold of the bed frame as the aircraft continued its violent descent, her knuckles white with the force of her grip, while stolen watches continued sliding across the floor around her feet like expensive marbles in a tilting box. The phone to the cockpit continued ringing without answer, and she could hear through the thin wall the sound of Derek's voice raised in what sounded like increasingly desperate argument with someone, though she couldn't make out the specific words over the noise of failing aircraft systems and wind rushing past the fuselage. Emma Rodriguez had strapped herself into her flight attendant seat as the aircraft's motion became increasingly violent, her professional training taking over as she prepared for what appeared to be an emergency landing, while simultaneously trying to understand why the captain was not in the cockpit dealing with what was obviously a serious mechanical problem. Through the galley service window, she could see that the cockpit door was open, but Derek was nowhere visible in his seat, leaving James Mitchell alone to deal with emergency procedures that were designed to require two experienced pilots working in coordination. "Dr. Chen," Emma called out through the intercom system. hoping that Alexandra could hear her voice over the aircraft noise and respond with some indication that she was safely secured for what promised to be a challenging landing attempt. Please return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We are experiencing mechanical difficulties and need to prepare for emergency landing. But Alexandra was trapped in the bedroom by the aircraft's violent motion and the fact that Derek had finally appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of rage and panic as he saw her surrounded by the scattered evidence of his criminal operation. The stolen watches glittered on the carpet like accusatory eyes, each one representing not just monetary value but another step in Derek's descent from respected airline captain to desperate criminal who had apparently chosen to pursue his illegal agenda even in the face of life-threatening mechanical emergencies. "What the hell are you doing back here?" Derek screamed over the noise of the struggling aircraft, his voice hoarse with desperation as he realized that his carefully planned smuggling operation had been exposed at the worst possible moment. "Those cases are supposed to be secured. You have no business going through private cargo." Alexandra stared at Derek with a mixture of anger and disbelief, her medical training helping her remain calm despite the terrifying circumstances as she tried to process the fact that this man had apparently prioritized his criminal activities over his responsibility to fly the aircraft safely. "Captain Blake, we need to talk about these watches later. Right now, you need to get back to the cockpit and help your co-pilot deal with whatever is wrong with this aircraft." "You don't understand," Derek said, advancing into the bedroom despite the aircraft's violent motion, his eyes wild with the look of a man who had lost all perspective about priorities and consequences. "If those watches don't reach Los Angeles on schedule, I'm a dead man. Vincent doesn't accept excuses about mechanical problems or nosy passengers. I need to get those cases secured and figure out how to complete this delivery, even if we have to emergency land in Denver." The revelation that Derek was more concerned about his criminal operation than the safety of everyone aboard the aircraft struck Alexandra like a physical blow, representing a level of moral corruption that went far beyond simple prejudice or professional incompetence and entered the realm of sociopathic disregard for human life. She realized that she was dealing with someone who had become so desperate and compromised that he might be capable of anything to protect his illegal activities, making him potentially dangerous to everyone aboard the aircraft. From the cockpit came James Mitchell's increasingly frantic voice as he struggled alone with emergency procedures that were becoming more complex and dangerous with each passing second. "Engine fire warning. I'm pulling the fire handle and shutting down engine 2. We're single engine now and losing altitude fast. Captain, I need you to take control so I can run the emergency checklist." The sound of James's distress seemed to penetrate Derek's criminal obsession for a moment, reminding him that he was still technically the pilot in command of an aircraft that was currently in mortal danger with passengers depending on his expertise to save their lives. But instead of immediately rushing back to his responsibilities, Derek hesitated, torn between his duty as a pilot and his terror about what would happen if Vincent discovered that the smuggling operation had failed due to his exposure and capture. Captain Alexandra said, her voice carrying the same authority she used when dealing with life and death situations in the operating room. "Whatever illegal activities you're involved in, they don't matter right now. That young man in the cockpit needs help, and we need to land this aircraft safely before we worry about anything else. Go fly the airplane and let me worry about securing this evidence." Derek looked around the bedroom at the scattered watches and the open cases that contained millions of dollars in stolen merchandise, then at Alexandra's face, which showed no fear despite their desperate circumstances, but rather the kind of steady determination that came from someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. For a moment his pilot training warred with his criminal desperation, and Alexandra could see the internal struggle playing out across his features as he tried to decide between saving lives and protecting his illegal operation. The decision was made for him when the aircraft lurched violently again, and James's voice came over the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Anyone who can hear this, We are in serious trouble. I'm a first officer, not a captain, and I need help from someone who knows these emergency procedures better than I do. We're going to try an emergency landing in Denver, but I'm not sure I can do this alone. Derek's pilot instincts finally overcame his criminal priorities as he heard the genuine fear in his co-pilot's voice and realized that his absence from the cockpit might result in a crash that would kill not only the passengers but also himself, making his illegal problems permanently irrelevant. With one last, desperate look at the scattered evidence of his crimes, Derek turned and rushed back toward the cockpit, leaving Alexandra alone in the bedroom with millions of dollars in stolen watches and the growing realization that their aircraft was in serious danger of becoming a smoking crater in the Colorado wilderness if Derek couldn't somehow pull together his professional skills despite his obvious psychological breakdown. The approach to Denver International Airport runway 34 left was unlike anything James Mitchell had experienced during his brief but promising aviation career, with the aircraft fighting his control inputs like a wounded animal trying to escape from a predator, while emergency vehicles raced across the airport surface below them with flashing lights that looked like earthbound stars against the black Colorado night. Derek had returned to the cockpit with the wild-eyed expression of a man whose world was collapsing in real time, but his hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of 25 years of professional flying, proving that even psychological breakdown couldn't completely erase the training and instincts that had once made him one of the most respected captains in private aviation. "Gear down, flaps 30 speed, 130 knots. Derek called out as he took control of the aircraft from James. His voice hoarse but steady as he focused all his remaining professional competence on the task of bringing the damaged Gulfstream safely to Earth. Despite the multiple system failures that had turned their luxury transport into a barely controllable piece of metal held aloft by physics, desperation, and whatever flying skills he could still access through the fog of criminal panic that clouded his judgment. James worked through the emergency landing checklist with mechanical precision, his hands moving across switches and controls while his mind tried to process the surreal combination of mechanical crisis and criminal revelation that had transformed their routine flight into something that would be remembered and investigated for years to come. The young co-pilot had spent months looking up to Derek as a mentor and role model, but the events of the past few hours had shattered those illusions completely, leaving him with the growing realization that the man he had admired was not only a criminal, but someone whose illegal activities had potentially contributed to their current emergency situation. In the main cabin, Emma Rodriguez had secured herself in her flight attendant seat and was quietly praying in Spanish while watching the approach lights of Denver International Airport grow larger through the aircraft windows, each light representing another few seconds closer to either salvation or catastrophe, depending on Derek's ability to overcome his personal demons long enough to demonstrate the flying skills that had once made him valuable to clients who demanded the highest levels of safety and professionalism from their flight crews. Alexandra had managed to gather most of the scattered watches and return them to their cases, securing the evidence of Derek's crimes while simultaneously preparing herself for what promised to be a challenging landing that would test the structural limits of an aircraft that had already demonstrated multiple system failures during their emergency descent. Her medical training had taught her to remain calm during crisis situations, but she couldn't help wondering whether she would survive to testify about Derek's criminal activities or whether they would all become victims of his decision to prioritize illegal smuggling over aviation safety. Tower Gulfstream 20 Alpha Charlie is on final approach with emergency equipment standing by. Derek transmitted to air traffic control, his voice carrying across the radio frequency to controllers who were coordinating what had become the most significant aviation emergency at Denver International Airport in several years. We've experienced engine failure and multiple system malfunctions, requesting fire and rescue to be ready for possible evacuation after landing. The aircraft touched down on runway 34 left with bone-jarring impact that sent vibrations through the fuselage and tested every rivet and weld in the Gulfstream structure. But Derek's landing technique proved that, even in his compromised state, he retained enough skill to keep them from becoming another aviation statistics. The emergency vehicles that had been standing by immediately converged on the aircraft as it rolled down the runway with smoke streaming from the failed engine, their crews prepared for anything from minor mechanical problems to catastrophic fire that could consume the aircraft and everyone aboard within minutes. As the aircraft finally came to a complete stop and Derek shut down the remaining systems, according to emergency procedures, the silence that followed the hours of mechanical noise and crisis management felt almost supernatural in its intensity. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke as they all processed the fact that they had survived what could easily have been a fatal accident. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that their problems were far from over, and in some ways were just beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced over the intercom, his voice carrying a mixture of professional pride at having completed a successful emergency landing and dread about the consequences that would inevitably follow their arrival on the ground. "We have landed safely at Denver International Airport. Please remain seated while emergency personnel inspect the aircraft and ensure it's safe to disembark." But even as Derek spoke those words, he could see through the cockpit windows that the vehicles surrounding their aircraft included not just fire and rescue equipment, but also the distinctive black SUVs that indicated federal law enforcement presence, suggesting that someone had already connected their emergency landing with other ongoing investigations that would make his criminal activities impossible to hide or minimize. The sight of FBI vehicles made Derek's stomach clench with the realization that his smuggling operation had somehow been compromised even before Alexandra's accidental discovery of the stolen watches. The aircraft door opened, with a hiss of escaping cabin pressure admitting the cold Colorado air, along with the first wave of emergency responders who immediately began assessing the aircraft for fire hazards or structural damage that might threaten the occupants. But behind the firefighters and paramedics came federal agents whose presence indicated that this was no longer simply an aviation emergency, but a crime scene that would be processed with the same meticulous attention to detail that Derek had once applied to pre-flight inspections. Captain Derek Blake. The lead FBI agent was a woman in her 40s whose calm professionalism somehow made her more intimidating than someone who relied on shouting or physical presence to establish authority. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. We need to speak with you immediately about some irregularities that have come to our attention regarding cargo manifests and customs declarations for this aircraft." Derek felt his knees buckle slightly as he realized that his criminal activities had been under investigation independently of Alexandra's accidental discovery, meaning that the smuggling operation had been compromised from multiple directions, and that his desperate attempts to complete one final delivery had led him directly into a federal trap. The irony that his prejudice toward Alexandra had contributed to exposing crimes that were already being investigated was not lost on him. But he was beyond caring about irony as he faced the collapse of everything he had risked his career and reputation to protect. Agent Martinez Alexandra said as she emerged from the aircraft carrying one of the cases containing stolen watches, her voice calm despite the extraordinary circumstances, as she approached the federal agents with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was on the right side of both law and morality. "I believe this evidence will be relevant to your investigation. I discovered these cases hidden in my aircraft's bedroom compartment, and I've documented everything with photographs that show their concealment and apparent value." The sight of Alexandra calmly presenting evidence of his crimes to federal agents while he stood helplessly watching felt like the final collapse of Derek's carefully constructed criminal enterprise. But what truly devastated him was the realization that his prejudice and hostility toward her had directly contributed to exposing the illegal activities that he had been so desperate to keep secret. If he had simply treated her with the professionalism that any passenger deserved, she would never have spent time in the bedroom compartment where the stolen watches were hidden, and his smuggling operation might have succeeded despite the federal investigation that was apparently already closing in on him. As federal agents began photographing the evidence and reading Derek his rights while James Mitchell watched in shock, and Emma Rodriguez provided witness testimony about Derek's recent behavioral changes and treatment of minority passengers. Alexandra felt a complex mixture of satisfaction at seeing justice served and sadness at the waste of human potential represented by Derek's transformation from respected pilot to desperate criminal. She understood that his crimes and prejudice were inexcusable, but she also recognized the tragedy of someone who had possessed genuine skill and responsibility choosing to destroy everything positive about his life in pursuit of easy money and criminal shortcuts. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Derek's smuggling operation, his connections to an international network of stolen luxury goods trafficking, and the pattern of racial bias that had characterized his treatment of passengers over many months leading up to his exposure and arrest. But as Alexandra watched federal agents lead Derek away in handcuffs while emergency vehicles continued processing the aircraft that had nearly become their tomb, she knew that this story was about more than just one man's criminal activities and prejudice. It was about the consequences of choosing hatred over humanity and the way that treating others with dignity and respect was not just morally right, but practically wise for anyone who wanted to build a life worth living. The FBI field office in Denver had been transformed into a nerve center of investigative activity within hours of Derek Blake's arrest, with agents working through the night to unravel a smuggling operation that proved to be far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected, based on the evidence recovered from Alexandra's aircraft. Special Agent Sarah Martinez sat across from Derek in interview room 3, watching him cycle through the classic stages of criminal denial: anger, bargaining, rationalization, and gradual acceptance, as the mounting evidence made it impossible for him to maintain his innocence or minimize his level of involvement in crimes that spanned multiple states and involved millions of dollars in stolen merchandise. "Captain Blake," Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had interrogated enough criminals to know that breaking down their defenses required persistence rather than aggression. "We've been investigating your smuggling network for 8 months. We have surveillance footage of you meeting with Vincent Carrera at 3 different airports, financial records showing payments to your personal accounts that correspond with successful deliveries, and now physical evidence of stolen goods found on your aircraft. The only question now is whether you're going to cooperate and help us shut down this operation completely, or whether you're going to let your associates continue victimizing other people while you sit in federal prison thinking about what you could have done differently." Derek stared at the table between them, his uniform rumpled and stained from the emergency landing, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the fact that his criminal activities had been under surveillance long before Alexandra's accidental discovery had provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure his conviction on multiple federal charges. The realization that his paranoia about exposure had been completely justified made him feel simultaneously vindicated and utterly defeated, like a man who had been right about the danger, but wrong about everything else that mattered in his life. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Derek said, finally his voice barely above a whisper, as he began the confession that would eventually fill 47 pages of federal court documents and provide prosecutors with everything they needed to dismantle an international smuggling ring that had been operating successfully for over 2 years. "I just needed money to pay off my gambling debts, and Vincent made it sound so simple. Just transport some packages from one airport to another. No questions asked. No one gets hurt." Meanwhile, at Presbyterian Hospital in Manhattan, Alexandra was concluding a press conference that had been hastily arranged to address media coverage of the emergency landing and her role in exposing Derek's criminal activities. The hospital's media relations team had initially been concerned about negative publicity, but Alexandra's calm and articulate responses to reporters' questions had transformed the story from a potential scandal into an inspiring narrative about integrity, courage, and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. "Doctor," Chen asked a reporter from CNN, "How do you feel about the fact that Captain Blake's prejudice toward you directly led to his exposure and arrest? Do you see this as a form of poetic justice?" Alexandra considered the question carefully before responding, her natural thoughtfulness preventing her from taking satisfaction in another person's downfall, even when that person had treated her with inexcusable disrespect and criminal recklessness. "I think Captain Blake's troubles began long before our encounter yesterday. His prejudice toward me was just a symptom of larger problems that included criminal activities, gambling addiction, and a worldview that allowed him to justify treating certain people as less worthy of respect than others. I hope he gets the help he needs to address those underlying issues, but I'm primarily grateful that his criminal activities have been stopped before they could harm more people." The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents followed the evidence trail that Derek's cooperation provided, leading to arrests across 5 states and the recovery of over $30 million in stolen luxury goods that had been taken from high-end retailers, private collectors, and jewelry stores throughout the United States and Europe. Vincent Carrera, the criminal mastermind who had recruited Derek and dozens of other aviation professionals into his smuggling network, was arrested at a private airport in Florida while attempting to flee the country with 2 suitcases full of stolen watches and a briefcase containing $3 million in cash. James Mitchell found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both a witness to Derek's crimes and a potential suspect whose knowledge of his captain's activities came under intense scrutiny from federal investigators, determined to ensure that the smuggling network had been completely dismantled. The young co-pilot spent hours in interviews with FBI agents, providing detailed accounts of Derek's behavioral changes over the months leading up to his arrest, while also demonstrating through his testimony that he had been completely unaware of the criminal cargo hidden aboard their aircraft. I kept noticing that Captain Blake seemed increasingly nervous and agitated during flights. James told investigators during his 3rd interview, his voice carrying the weight of guilt at having missed signs that might have prevented the dangerous emergency landing that nearly killed everyone aboard. He would make mysterious phone calls, spend extra time inspecting cargo compartments, and became hostile toward passengers who didn't fit his expectations about what wealthy travelers should look like. I should have reported my concerns to management, but I convinced myself that he was just having personal problems that would resolve themselves over time. Emma Rodriguez provided crucial testimony about Derek's pattern of discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers, documenting incidents over several months where he had treated Black, Hispanic, and Asian travelers with suspicion and hostility that went far beyond normal security consciousness and entered the realm of racial profiling that created uncomfortable situations for both passengers and crew members. Her detailed accounts provided federal prosecutors with evidence of bias that would be used during sentencing to demonstrate that Derek's crimes were motivated not just by financial desperation, but by deep-seated prejudice that made him view certain people as acceptable targets for his criminal activities. Captain Blake created an atmosphere of tension and discrimination that made my job significantly more difficult. Emma testified to the federal grand jury that would eventually indict Derek on 17 felony charges, including smuggling, transportation of stolen goods, reckless endangerment, and federal civil rights violations. He treated passengers differently based on their race and appearance, and when I tried to address these issues professionally, he made it clear that my concerns were unwelcome and could affect my employment if I continued raising them. The media coverage of Derek's arrest and the circumstances that led to his exposure created a national conversation about discrimination in the aviation industry, with several other pilots and flight attendants coming forward to report similar experiences with colleagues whose bias toward certain passengers had created hostile environments for both crew members and travelers. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new training requirements for all aviation professionals, focusing on bias awareness, cultural sensitivity, and the legal obligations of service providers to treat all passengers with equal dignity and respect. Alexandra's role in exposing Derek's crimes, combined with her distinguished medical career and philanthropic activities, made her a reluctant but powerful symbol for the principle that success and respectability could not be determined by appearance or assumptions about who belonged in exclusive spaces. Speaking requests poured in from organizations across the country, all wanting to hear her perspective on discrimination, integrity, and the importance of maintaining dignity even when confronted with prejudice and hostility from people in positions of authority. Robert Thorne, CEO of the aviation management company that had employed Derek, found his business facing intense scrutiny from both federal investigators and media outlets determined to understand how a criminal with obvious behavioral problems had maintained his position for so long without triggering oversight or intervention from company management. The investigation revealed a corporate culture that prioritized client satisfaction over safety concerns, leading to the implementation of new policies requiring regular psychological evaluations for all flight crews and mandatory reporting procedures for discriminatory behavior or other warning signs of professional misconduct. As the scope of Derek's criminal activities became clear and the federal case against him grew stronger with each day of investigation, Alexandra made a decision that surprised many observers but perfectly reflected her character and values. Instead of pursuing maximum penalties against Derek personally, she chose to focus her energy on ensuring that the aviation industry implemented changes that would prevent future discrimination and create accountability mechanisms for protecting both passengers and ethical crew members from the kind of toxic environment that Derek's prejudice had created. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed beyond capacity on the morning of Derek Blake's sentencing hearing, with representatives from civil rights organizations, aviation industry professionals, victims of the smuggling ring, and media outlets from across the country, all gathered to witness the conclusion of a case that had become a national symbol of how prejudice and criminal behavior could intersect to create devastating consequences for everyone involved. Judge Patricia Morrison, known throughout the federal judicial system for her meticulous preparation and unwavering commitment to both justice and human dignity, had spent weeks reviewing the extensive evidence file and victim impact statements that would inform her decision about Derek's fate. Derek sat at the defendant's table, wearing an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his overworked public defender. His appearance a stark contrast to the confident pilot who had once commanded respect from passengers and crew members around the world. The months since his arrest had aged him dramatically, transforming him from someone who looked like a movie star playing an airline captain into a hollow-eyed man whose haunted expression suggested he finally understood the full magnitude of what he had lost through his own choices and actions. Your Honor. Assistant United States Attorney Catherine Mills began her sentencing recommendation. The defendant's crimes represent more than simple greed or momentary lapses in judgment. They reveal a pattern of behavior that combined criminal conspiracy with racial bias, creating a toxic environment that endangered passengers, corrupted the aviation industry, and violated the fundamental principle that all people deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. The prosecutor methodically outlined the evidence against Derek, from his participation in an international smuggling ring that had stolen over $50 million in luxury goods to his discriminatory treatment of minority passengers that had created hostile environments for travelers who had paid for professional service but received prejudice instead. The financial crimes were serious enough to warrant significant prison time, but the civil rights violations added an additional dimension that spoke to Derek's character and the broader social impact of his actions. Furthermore, Attorney Mills continued the defendant's behavior on the day of his arrest demonstrates a complete disregard for public safety that bordered on sociopathic. When faced with a mechanical emergency that threatened the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft, he initially abandoned his post to protect his criminal cargo, rather than focusing on his primary responsibility as pilot in command to ensure the safety of his passengers and crew. James Mitchell, now working as a captain for a different aviation company that had hired him based on his courage during the emergency landing and his cooperation with federal investigators, testified about Derek's abandonment of duty during their life-threatening situation. Your Honor, I'm a pilot, and I understand that we all face difficult decisions under pressure. But what Captain Blake did that night wasn't just unprofessional. It was a complete abandonment of everything that pilots are supposed to stand for. He left me alone in the cockpit during an emergency because he was more concerned about his criminal activities than about saving lives. Emma Rodriguez, who had been promoted to head of passenger services for a major airline based on her courage in reporting Derek's discriminatory behavior, provided testimony about the hostile work environment that his prejudice had created and the impact it had on both crew members and passengers who deserved better treatment than they received. Captain Blake didn't just commit crimes against the people he robbed. She testified he committed crimes against every passenger he treated with disrespect and every crew member he forced to participate in his discrimination through silence and complicity. When Alexandra was called to provide her victim impact statement, she approached the podium with the same calm dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal, from the initial confrontation at Teterboro Airport through the emergency landing and subsequent investigation. Her presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the courtroom, not just because of her role in exposing Derek's crimes, but because of the moral authority she had earned through her grace under pressure and her commitment to using the experience to create positive change. Your Honor, Alexandra began, her voice clear and strong as she looked directly at Derek for the first time since their emergency landing when I first encountered Captain Blake on the tarmac in New Jersey. I thought I was dealing with simple prejudice, the kind of assumption-based discrimination that successful people of color encounter regularly when our appearance doesn't match other people's expectations about who belongs in spaces of privilege and power. Derek stared at the table in front of him, unable to meet Alexandra's gaze as she continued her statement with the kind of measured precision that reflected both her medical training and her determination to ensure that her words carried maximum impact without descending into vindictiveness or personal attack. What I discovered instead was something far more troubling. A man whose prejudice had evolved into criminal behavior, whose bias had become so normalized that he felt comfortable risking innocent lives to protect illegal activities that were motivated by his sense of entitlement to judge and exploit others. Alexandra paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the silent courtroom before continuing with the portion of her statement that would be quoted in news articles and legal journals for years to come. Captain Blake, your crimes weren't just against the people whose property you stole or the aviation industry whose reputation you damaged. Your crimes were against the principle that all people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like or where they come from. She turned slightly to address Derek directly, her voice carrying both sadness and strength as she delivered what would prove to be the most memorable portion of her victim impact statement. I don't hate you, Captain Blake. I pity you because you had gifts, professional skills, responsibility for others' safety, opportunities to make positive contributions to the world, and you chose to use those gifts to hurt people instead of helping them. You flew planes that could have carried doctors to disaster areas or brought families together for important celebrations, but instead you used your aircraft to transport stolen goods and your position to make vulnerable people feel unwelcome and unsafe. Derek finally looked up at Alexandra as she concluded her statement. His eyes filled with what appeared to be genuine remorse, but which came too late to matter for purposes of justice or redemption. Your Honor, I ask that Captain Blake's sentence reflect not just the financial crimes he committed, but the human costs of his bias and the importance of sending a message that prejudice combined with criminal behavior will be met with consequences severe enough to deter others who might consider following his example. Judge Morrison listened carefully to all the testimony and statements before announcing Derek's sentence, her words carrying the weight of legal precedent and moral authority that would make the case a landmark in federal prosecution of crimes that combined financial fraud with civil rights violations. Mr. Blake, Your crimes reveal a character that prioritized personal gain over human dignity and criminal conspiracy over professional responsibility. The court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, and orders you to pay $14 million in restitution to the victims of your smuggling operation. The sentence was significantly harsher than Derek's attorney had hoped for, but entirely consistent with federal guidelines for his crimes when combined with the bias enhancement that Judge Morrison applied based on evidence of his discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers. As federal marshals led Derek away in handcuffs, he turned back toward the courtroom gallery where Alexandra sat with quiet dignity, his mouth forming words that might have been an apology but which were lost in the distance and noise of justice being carried out. Alexandra watched Derek's removal from the courtroom with mixed emotions, feeling satisfaction that justice had been served, but also genuine sadness that someone with real skills and responsibilities had chosen to waste his potential on hatred and crime instead of using his position to make positive contributions to the world. The resolution felt both complete and incomplete. Complete in terms of legal consequences, but incomplete in terms of the broader changes needed to address the bias and discrimination that had enabled Derek's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. The conference room on the 37th floor of the Manhattan office building overlooked Central Park in all its autumn glory, but Alexandra's attention was focused entirely on the group of aviation industry executives, federal officials, and civil rights advocates who had gathered to discuss implementing the comprehensive reforms that would emerge from the Derek Blake case and transform how airlines and private aviation companies addressed discrimination and bias in their operations. 6 months had passed since Derek's sentencing, and Alexandra had used that time to convert her traumatic experience into a powerful platform for change that was already producing concrete results across the aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Administration is implementing new mandatory bias awareness training for all licensed pilots, flight attendants, and aviation management personnel, announced FAA Administrator Rebecca Torres, a distinguished Latina administrator who had been appointed to head the agency based partly on her commitment to addressing discrimination in aviation. The training will be required annually and will include specific scenarios based on real incidents, including the Blake case, to ensure that aviation professionals understand both their legal obligations and the human impact of discriminatory behavior. Robert Thorne, whose aviation management company had survived the scandal surrounding Derek's crimes but had been forced to implement sweeping changes to company culture and oversight procedures, presented the new industry protocols that would be adopted voluntarily by aviation companies seeking to demonstrate their commitment to equal treatment of all passengers. We've created a passenger advocacy position at every level of our operations, Thorne explained, with direct reporting to senior management and protection from retaliation for employees who report bias or discrimination concerns. Alexandra had spent the months since Derek's conviction traveling to speaking engagements, congressional hearings, and industry conferences using her unique perspective as both victim and witness to advocate for changes that would address the underlying cultural problems that had enabled Derek's behavior to continue unchecked for so long. Her foundation had expanded beyond medical philanthropy to include a program focused on combating discrimination in transportation, hospitality, and other service industries where bias could create dangerous or humiliating situations for travelers and customers. The Alexandra Chen Foundation for Equity and Justice has committed $50 million over 5 years to fund bias awareness training, victim support services, and research into the intersection between prejudice and public safety, Alexandra announced to the assembled group of industry leaders and government officials. We're particularly focused on addressing the ways that bias can compromise safety procedures when personnel make assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces or who deserves certain levels of service and respect. James Mitchell, who had become an unexpected advocate for industry reform, based on his experience witnessing Derek's breakdown and criminal behavior, represented the newly formed Association of Ethical Aviation Professionals, an organization created by crew members who were committed to holding their industry accountable for creating safe and respectful environments for both passengers and employees. We've established confidential reporting procedures that allow crew members to document bias incidents without fear of retaliation, James explained, because we learned from the Blake case that enabling discrimination through silence ultimately endangers everyone involved. Emma Rodriguez had used her experience as a witness to Derek's discriminatory behavior to earn promotion to a senior position with the International Association of Flight Attendants, where she now headed a new division focused on passenger rights and crew member education about recognizing and addressing bias in aviation settings. Flight attendants are often the first to notice when passengers are being treated unfairly, Emma told the group, but we need training support and protection from retaliation when we report concerns about discriminatory behavior by pilots, ground crew, or management personnel. The changes being implemented went far beyond simple training requirements or policy adjustments, representing a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry viewed its responsibilities to passengers and the broader public. Airlines were adopting new hiring practices that emphasized cultural sensitivity alongside technical competence, implementing passenger feedback systems that specifically addressed bias concerns, and creating promotion pathways for employees who demonstrated commitment to equality and inclusion in their daily work. What we learned from the Blake case, explained Dr. Michael Washington, a sociologist who had been hired to study discrimination in transportation industries, is that bias doesn't exist in isolation from other problems. Captain Blake's prejudice towards certain passengers was connected to his criminal activities, his professional deterioration, and his willingness to endanger lives to protect his illegal operation. Addressing discrimination isn't just about being fair. It's about maintaining the professional standards that keep everyone safe. The legal precedent established by Derek's prosecution had created new tools for federal prosecutors to pursue enhanced penalties for crimes that included bias motivation, while also providing civil rights attorneys with stronger foundations for representing victims of discrimination in transportation settings. Several other cases involving prejudicial treatment of passengers had already resulted in successful prosecutions and civil settlements, demonstrating that the Blake case represented the beginning rather than the end of accountability efforts in the aviation industry. Alexandra's personal transformation from victim to advocate had been gradual but profound, as she recognized that her medical expertise in saving lives could be complemented by advocacy work focused on protecting dignity and ensuring equal treatment for all people regardless of their appearance, background, or presumed social status. Her speeches at industry conferences had become legendary for their combination of moral clarity and practical wisdom, providing concrete guidance for professionals who wanted to do the right thing but needed education about recognizing and addressing their own unconscious biases. The goal isn't perfection, Alexandra told the group as their meeting concluded, because none of us are free from unconscious bias or the assumptions we make about other people based on limited information. The goal is accountability, creating systems that catch bias before it becomes discrimination, that support people who speak up about unfair treatment, and that demonstrate through consequences that prejudice and professional responsibility cannot coexist in industries where people's safety and dignity depend on our judgment and competence. As the various participants prepared to return to their organizations and begin implementing the reforms they had agreed upon, Alexandra allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at the progress that had been made since that rainy afternoon at Teterboro Airport, when Derek's prejudice had seemed like just another unpleasant encounter with someone who couldn't see past her appearance to recognize her worth. The criminal prosecution had provided justice, but the industry changes represented something more important. The possibility that Derek's downfall could prevent other people from experiencing the kind of discrimination and disrespect that had been so commonplace in aviation that most industry professionals had simply accepted it as inevitable, rather than working to change it. The same autumn rain that had fallen 18 months earlier was drumming against the windows of Teterboro Airport's private aviation terminal as Alexandra emerged from her black sedan, but everything else about the scene represented a transformation so complete that it might have been a different world entirely from the one where Derek Blake had treated her with such contempt and disrespect. The security guard who checked her identification was Thomas Wilson, the same man who had questioned her passenger status during that first encounter. But his demeanor now reflected the comprehensive bias awareness training that had been implemented across the entire aviation industry in response to the Derek Blake case and its aftermath. "Good afternoon," Dr. Chen Thomas said with genuine warmth and professionalism as he verified her identification with the same careful attention he would provide to any passenger regardless of their appearance or choice of transportation. "Captain Mitchell is waiting for you aboard your aircraft, and I believe congratulations are in order for your foundation's recognition by the United Nations Human Rights Council. That's quite an honor and well-deserved based on everything I've read about your work." Alexandra smiled gratefully at Thomas's courtesy, remembering their previous interaction and appreciating the growth that was possible when people were given education support and accountability for treating others with dignity and respect. "Thank you, Thomas. The recognition belongs to everyone who has worked to make aviation safer and more welcoming for all passengers. Individual awards are less important than collective progress toward the kind of industry we can all be proud to be part of." Walking across the tarmac toward her Gulfstream G650, Alexandra reflected on the journey that had brought her from that moment of humiliation and danger to this afternoon's departure for Geneva, where she would address the United Nations about the intersection between discrimination, public safety, and human rights in transportation industries worldwide. The aircraft looked exactly the same as it had during that first flight, but she knew that the crew aboard represented the kind of professionals who understood that treating passengers with dignity was not just a customer service preference, but a fundamental requirement for anyone entrusted with others' safety and well-being. Captain James Mitchell stood at the top of the aircraft stairs, wearing his new uniform with its 4 gold stripes, his promotion from co-pilot to captain having been accelerated based on his courage during the emergency landing and his leadership in industry reform efforts since Derek's conviction and imprisonment. At 29, James had become one of the youngest captains in private aviation, but his maturity and commitment to ethical behavior had earned him respect throughout the industry and made him a sought-after speaker at conferences focused on professional responsibility and bias awareness. "Dr. Chen, welcome aboard," James said with the kind of genuine warmth that distinguished true hospitality from mere professional courtesy, his smile reflecting both his pleasure at seeing her again and his pride in the progress they had achieved together since that terrifying night over Colorado. "We're honored to be flying you to Geneva for your UN address, and I want you to know that our entire crew has been following your advocacy work with admiration and gratitude for everything you've accomplished." The aircraft's cabin had been subtly modified since Alexandra's purchase, with the addition of a small plaque near the main entrance that read, "In memory of all travelers who have faced discrimination. May this aircraft carry only dignity, respect, and safe passage for everyone who boards." The plaque had been Alexandra's idea, implemented as a reminder that luxury and privilege came with responsibilities toward others, and that the true measure of success was not wealth accumulation, but positive impact on other people's lives. Emma Rodriguez, now wearing the uniform of a senior flight attendant with additional insignia, indicating her role as passenger advocate and bias awareness trainer, greeted Alexandra with the same warmth she had shown during their first meeting, but with additional confidence that reflected her growth into a leadership position within the aviation industry. "Dr. Chen, it's wonderful to see you again. I've prepared some materials about the new passenger advocacy programs that several airlines have implemented based on recommendations from your foundation, and I think you'll be pleased with the progress we're making." As they settled in for the flight to Geneva, Alexandra reviewed her notes for the UN address that would outline how transportation discrimination represented a global human rights issue requiring coordinated international response and standardized accountability measures. Her speech would draw on the Derek Blake case as an example of how prejudice could intersect with criminal behavior and public safety concerns, but it would focus primarily on the positive changes that were possible when industries, governments, and civil society organizations worked together to address bias and create inclusive environments for all travelers. The flight to Geneva proceeded with the kind of smooth professionalism that had always been possible in aviation, but which now carried additional meaning because it represented conscious choice rather than mere technical competence. James flew the aircraft with skill that honored his training and responsibility, while Emma provided service that demonstrated genuine care for passenger comfort and safety, rather than going through motions dictated by company policy or customer expectations. During the flight, Alexandra received a call from her assistant updating her on recent developments in the ongoing impact of the Derek Blake case and related reform efforts. Vincent Carrera and his criminal associates had been sentenced to prison terms ranging from 15 to 30 years for their roles in the international smuggling operation, while the recovered stolen goods had been returned to their rightful owners and insurance companies. The financial restitution ordered by federal courts had been used to fund victim compensation programs and law enforcement training initiatives focused on detecting and preventing similar crimes. More importantly, from Alexandra's perspective, the cultural changes in aviation had begun producing measurable results in terms of reduced passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment, increased reporting of bias incidents by crew members, and improved safety outcomes that correlated with the enhanced professionalism training that emphasized treating all passengers with equal respect and attention. Airlines that had implemented comprehensive bias awareness programs were seeing improvements in customer satisfaction, employee retention, and safety metrics, proving that treating people with dignity was not just morally correct, but practically beneficial for business operations. Dr. Chen Emma said as they began their descent into Geneva, "I wanted to thank you again for your courage in speaking out about what happened with Captain Blake. I know it would have been easier to just file a complaint privately and move on, but your decision to use the experience to advocate for industry-wide changes has made a real difference for countless passengers and crew members who deserve better treatment than they were receiving." Alexandra looked out the window at the Swiss Alps rising majestically around Geneva, their snow-covered peaks representing the kind of timeless beauty that put human conflicts and achievements into perspective, while simultaneously inspiring commitment to worthy causes that could outlast any individual contribution. Emma. The real courage belonged to people like you and James, who were willing to speak up about problems you were observing and to support changes even when it meant challenging established practices and authority figures who resisted accountability. As they landed at Geneva International Airport and prepared for Alexandra's final departure to address the United Nations, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at the distance they had all traveled since that rainy afternoon at Teterboro when Derek's prejudice had seemed like an insurmountable barrier to dignity and respect. The criminal justice system had provided appropriate consequences for Derek's crimes, but the industry changes represented something more valuable: proof that tragic experiences could be transformed into positive change when people chose accountability over defensiveness and growth over comfort. James Mitchell shut down the aircraft's engines with the same careful attention to detail that Derek Blake had once possessed, but with additional awareness of his responsibilities toward passengers, crew members, and the broader aviation community that depended on every professional to uphold the highest standards of safety, competence, and human decency. As Alexandra prepared to disembark for her UN address, James reflected on how the Derek Blake case had changed not just aviation procedures, but his own understanding of what it meant to be a pilot in an industry where technical skill was meaningless without moral integrity. The black sedan that would carry Alexandra to the United Nations building was waiting at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, its driver standing at attention with the kind of respect that came from understanding he was transporting someone whose work mattered beyond personal achievement and extended to fundamental questions about human dignity and equal treatment under law. As Alexandra walked down the stairs for what would be her final flight in the aircraft that had carried her through trauma to advocacy, she carried with her not just her speech notes, but the accumulated wisdom of everyone whose lives had been changed by Derek Blake's crimes and the justice that followed. The rain had stopped by the time Alexandra reached the UN building, allowing sunshine to break through the clouds and illuminate the flags of member nations that represented humanity's ongoing struggle to create laws, institutions, and cultures that protected the dignity of all people, regardless of their appearance, background, or circumstances. Her speech would add one more voice to that conversation, but it would carry special authority because it emerged from direct experience with both the costs of discrimination and the possibilities for redemption when societies chose justice over convenience and growth over comfort. 3 years after Derek Blake's conviction, aviation industry data showed a 47% reduction in passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment, while bias awareness training had become standard practice across not just airlines, but hotels, restaurants, and other service industries that recognized the connection between respectful treatment and business success. James Mitchell had become the youngest chief pilot in private aviation history, heading a company specifically created to provide bias-free transportation services, while Emma Rodriguez directed the industry's first comprehensive passenger advocacy program that had prevented dozens of discrimination incidents through early intervention and education. Derek Blake served his federal sentence at a minimum security prison facility where he participated in rehabilitation programs focused on addiction recovery and bias reduction, eventually becoming a trainer for other inmates struggling with gambling problems and racial prejudice. His letters from prison, later published with his permission, provided insight into how personal failures could escalate into criminal behavior when combined with unchecked bias and the rationalization that certain people deserved less respect than others. While his crimes could never be undone, his cooperation with researchers studying discrimination helped develop more effective intervention programs for preventing similar cases. Dr. Alexandra Chen's foundation expanded its mission beyond aviation to address bias and discrimination across transportation, healthcare, education, and employment funding, research training programs, and victim support services that transformed her personal trauma into lasting positive change for millions of people worldwide. Her story became a standard case study in business schools, law schools, and ethics courses demonstrating how dignity, courage, and strategic advocacy could triumph over prejudice and create institutional changes that protected future generations from experiencing the discrimination that had once seemed inevitable and unchangeable.